Good morning. Thank you for joining us for another virtual genealogy program with Terri Meeks. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. Before I turn over to Terri, I do have a few housekeeping tips and a couple of announcements. We ask that if you have any questions during the program to please type your questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentation, and we will make sure to answer any questions at the end of the program. You can test that feature now by typing hello. As for upcoming events, the museum will be hosting a Kids Fossil Day next Saturday, June 20th, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the museum. It will feature a number of fun fossil activities for kids of all ages, including the Fossilmobile from Florissant. Our next community coffee will be on Thursday, June 25th at 9 a.m. This month's topic is Memories of Celebrating Independence Day in lieu of our nation's 250th anniversary. Also, we do have a few 150-250 Fremont County passport booklets available. If you are looking for some fun activities to do this summer with your family, please stop by one of the Fremont County passport centers. Of course, our museum is one of those, and pick up one of the last printed copies for your fun activities for the summer. You can also download the booklet through the Fremont County Historical Society's website at fremonthistory.com/blank. If you complete all the activities, you can earn a cool 150-250 challenge coin. To learn more about upcoming museum programs and 150-250 events, please visit our website at canyonscity.gov/museum or follow us on Facebook. Finally, the next virtual genealogy class will be held on Saturday, July 11th at 9 a.m. Registration for the class will be available online in the coming weeks. Thank you again for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. When I was a student in school, I remember learning about the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the main focus of it was rural electrification. And I remember learning about that. But when digging into the topic, I learned so much more. So let's dive in. For many, many years, my thing is not advancing. Oops. For many, many years, there were floods for a couple of hundred years, at least when the area was populated. There were floods, there was major destruction, crops were inundated, people died, and whole families had to move. So let's look at a couple of those incidents to see why this Tennessee Valley Authority was so needed. One of the first recorded floods that I could find was in April of 1791. And it was the first recorded flood along the Shenandoah River. A couple of interesting quotes. There was naught but a sea of turbulent fury. Everything in its path was swept clean. At that time, 1791, of course, there were wooden or stone bridges. For the most part, roads were made out of dirt, so they became mud or totally impassable. And of course, homes were flooded and, heaven forbid, washed away. Many years later, in 1867, Chattanooga experienced extensive damage during what was called the Great Deluge. From every direction, we hear of the destruction of bridges and the carrying away of trestle work. There was loss of life. There was heavy structural damage. At that time, the telegraph existed, and those lines were either downed, swept away, but completely destroyed. Crops and livestock were washed away, as were businesses and homes. So they recognized as early as 1867 some kind of need for flood control. In the city of Chattanooga, the city officials actually were thinking about raising the street level 1 story throughout the city, hopefully preventing inundation yet again. And here is a picture from that 1867 flood. We see the gentleman sitting high above the floodwaters. And from the National Union and Express, we see reporting. Bridges, log cabins, and frame buildings were all washed away or damaged. Men working in canoes to secure the property of the sawmills and lumber yards. The market street was inundated. These damages, these cannot be estimated at present. So serious business for, at that time, a larger, almost metropolitan area. 1901, the highest flood stages for these 3 rivers. The heaviest and most disastrous rains fell today in Asheville and the surrounding country that have visited this country in years. Bridges are gone and many roads are impassable. The water is up to the floors in many dwellings. The waters of the French Broad and the Swannanoa rivers have reached the highest point on record. Hundreds of Asheville people have gone to Biltmore today to see the damage of the ideal village of Mr. Vanderbilt. 1 row of cottages was flooded. So even Mr. Vanderbilt did not escape some damage. The flood in 1916 resulted from 2 hurricanes that swept through the communities. There was substantial rainfall in the first storm, so the ground conditions were already soft, muddied, and vulnerable, highly vulnerable at this time. More than 22 inches of rain fell in 24 hours for that second storm. So there was significant, actually, I think it's only 83 we will see loss of life, but there were some missing people as well. Significant damage to the communities, urban and rural areas, crops and livestock. All of these things suffered as a result of this huge flood. And you can imagine how, when your home is swept away or your business is inundated in some way, how your life is going to be altered. The little town of Marshall, which is built with its back to the mountains and has the French Broad River for its front yard, has felt the full force and fury of the flood. The waters exacted a toll from the town as it swept down the river in all its ungovernable fury, and the tales of sorrow and suffering amongst the people are many. And we do see some of the flood details. People were still missing at this time. This is from the Washington Star. There was property loss. Local relief committees were headed up to help out with those that had suffered during this flood. So we've seen from 1791, 1867, when they recognized that something needed to be done. And here we are in probably the 1890s when the Army Corps of Engineers, they came up with the idea that dam sites along the Tennessee River might help with some flood control. It would provide electricity generation. It would help with the rivers, the major rivers, to improve navigation so that farmers, merchants could get their products to larger areas for sale. It would also provide potential employment for the area. So we're thinking 1890s here, but it's going to take a lot longer. It took World War I, and at least approximately 20 years. And finally, President Wilson signed the National Defense Act, and this authorized the construction of nitrate plants. They needed ammunition for the war. So it was proposed that they would construct a dam at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and the hydroelectric power would help to generate the power to run these plants and produce ammunition. The construction began in 1918, just as the United States was entering the war. Unfortunately, the war ended in the end of 1918, and the Wilson Dam, was not completed until 1924. So there was not much ammunition produced here. Here is a photo of the construction of the Wilson Dam. And interestingly enough, during this period when the Wilson Dam was being constructed, Henry Ford in 1921 offered to lease the area for 99 years for $5 million. And he promised that he would finish the dam and construct another one, a new one further upstream. He actually planned to create a whole city for workers' housing and develop the area for industrialization, and he would hire millions of workers. Fortunately or not, there was a considerable objection to this. There was a movement that recognized that electrical power was held by private companies for the most part at this time. And there was controversy about that, and people objected to it. They felt that this was a public resource, and it should not be in private control. And eventually, Henry Ford did back off, and the dam was completed by the government. As the Depression went on, this distrust, the movement grew. Americans did not want their electric utilities in private ownership. They wanted the utilities to be owned publicly. Senator George Norris, at the time, was one of the main people who blocked the Ford proposal. He did not feel that the dam would fare well under Ford's ownership, and that the dam should be part of a larger scale program. He wanted not just to generate the power to create the nitrates and the factory for the nitrates. He wanted to address the idea of controlling that flooding, controlling soil erosion, and to give people in his region electrical power. So here we are. We've started it in the 1890s. We're into the Depression. What is the Tennessee Valley like in 1930 at the height of the Depression? Serious economic hardship. Not only did they experience the same things as the nation as a whole, with business closures, unemployment, reduced wages for those who were still working, but the Tennessee Valley had extreme poverty. They had been using poor farming practices, and the soil was depleted. Farm prices went down. And in 1931, unfortunately, there was a drought. So the Tennessee Valley people experienced crop failures. Because of their farming practices and the combination of that with floods, there was serious soil erosion, deforestation. Trees fell during these floods. There was a lack of infrastructure in the Tennessee Valley. Fewer than 2% of the people had electricity. Poverty and isolation in those hills, in those valleys, they were not heavily populated. And because it was a warm climate with a lot of water, it promoted disease, especially malaria and hookworm. At this point, half of the population was on relief, whereas on the national level, the relief population was only about 25%. So we're talking about double. There was an extremely low literacy rate in the Tennessee Valley at this time. And we see some small houses in a very, very small community. We see some that have experienced some of this damage and hopefully have been abandoned. And we see some of the floods in towns. So finally, 40 years later, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act is signed by President Roosevelt. And this act created a public corporation to address the issues that we've been talking about. They wanted to improve navigability, get that flood control, get those floodwaters somehow under control, generate electricity so more than that 2% would have electrification in their homes, reforestation and proper use of the land so that when floods came along, perhaps they would not be so devastating. By this time, 1933, there had been some industrial development. Those larger cities, Asheville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, they were thriving cities. So they wanted to provide further development into the inland, more country areas, and also improve agricultural output. The act gave the Tennessee Valley Authority authority to acquire land along in the Tennessee Valley and its tributaries, along the river itself and the tributaries that fed into it, in order to construct dams, reservoirs, get that electrification through transmission lines and power plants. Within 1 year, by 1934, more than 9,000 people were employed by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Eventually, the agency, between 1933 and 1944, just those 11 years, 16 hydroelectric dams were actually constructed. The act directed that the headquarters would be among the people it served. And the headquarters is in Knoxville, and there is a very large office complex in Chattanooga. So it is there where the people live. This was something that I thought that I found new and interesting. When I had heard about the Tennessee Valley Authority as a child, I thought it had to do with Tennessee, but it was a far more expansive program. And when we look at the Tennessee Valley on a map, we see how all of these states are indeed affected. The blue area shows the Tennessee Valley and the tributary rivers, as well as the main rivers going through. And each one of those small squares represents a major TVA dam. I mentioned that there were 16 that were actually constructed. There were additional ones that already existed that were acquired. And I believe there are a total of 25 dams today. Here are 8 of the 16 dams that were built between 1933 and 1944. And we're going to look at least one, if not 2, of these dams. As I mentioned, they also acquired dams that originally existed. So these were added to that number as well. In all, today, there are 652 miles of waterways that are under the authority of the Tennessee Valley. There is a stairway of 26 dams and 13 locks. And there are dams along the tributary rivers and reservoirs as well. So let's look at that first major TVA project. The Norris Dam. Construction began on October 1st of 1933, right after the act was signed. It's 265 feet high, 1,860 feet long. It's a big dam. It's a gravity flow dam. It is made of concrete and it spans 2 counties in Tennessee. They did build a power station along the dam for a total cost of $36 million. But it took them 2.5 years. It opened in March of 1936. So what did it take to build the Norris Dam? One of the first things they had to do was acquire the land in order to build the dam and also to create the reservoir behind the dam. They did, for the Norris Dam, they did actually purchase land from farmers, probably at a reduced price, but the towns of Lewiston, Big Barren, and Baker's Forge were inundated. They had to move the people out of these towns and place them somewhere else. There were actually 2,841 families that were displaced by the construction of the Norris Dam. In addition to the living families, Cemeteries also had to be relocated. And in this particular case, over 5,000 graves had to be relocated. They actually created a new town called Norris. It was a planned community, especially to house the workers. And it did include a school and recreation facilities. Here's a picture of approximately the 2,000 men that were working on the Norris Dam. And look at the landscape, how flat it is at this particular moment. And here's what it looks like now. This is the Norris Dam, and we see the power plant at the base, and we see that huge reservoir, the land that was flooded to create the reservoir and control the flooding. The Wheeler Dam, it was the second one, and it was started the month later in November. It was 72 feet high, so not nearly as high, but 6,342 feet long, over a mile. And this dam had 2 locks, which would raise and lower vessels up to 52 feet. That's huge. Here again, it spans 2 counties, this time in Alabama. They too built a power station that had 11 generating units for a total cost of $87 million. And it took 3 years almost to the day to complete. Like the former, they had to acquire the land first, and they did purchase the land from farmers. Rural areas and small communities were relocated, and only 840 families. That's still a huge number. And if you were affected by it, if your family members were affected by it, what was their reaction? 176 graves from cemeteries had to be relocated. And this time, roads, 30 miles of roads had to be rerouted in order to accommodate the dam and either go over it or around it. It did employ 4,700 workers. And we see the construction of the Wheeler Dam. We see the construction of the power plant at the Wheeler Dam. And we see some of the housing for the engineer and the superintendent. Pretty luxurious, I would say. And here is the completed dam. Today, there is something that is called locking through. This is part of the navigational improvements that the Corps of Engineers and the workers did for the Tennessee Valley Authority. The whole series of locks are operated by the Corps of Engineers, and there is a priority for traffic through the locks. Government vessels have first priority, followed by commercial passenger vessels, commercial vessels and tows, and finally recreational boats. This series of, it's only 9 locks that are on this series, and 5 of those are open 24 hours a day. 4 of them are only open from 7 a.m. to 3 a.m. That's just short of 4 hours in the early AM hours. So they're pretty close to 24 hours. And it is free to go through this whole series of locks. This is the Wilson Dam lock, or the Wilson lock. And we see the height where the water is going to rise. Butler, Tennessee. This is the town that wouldn't drown. It was the largest populated community and the only incorporated town that was inundated in order to build a dam. The construction began in 1942, and they had to move the people, lock, stock, and barrel. And unfortunately, work was halted within the first 9 months because World War II, and the men were being called to fight. Construction resumed in 1946. And by 1947, all real estate interest of the town had been purchased. They spent they allocated a total of $35,000 to accomplish this relocation. A nonprofit corporation was formed to obtain 200 acres of farmland. And the TVA and Tennessee State Planning Commission, they mapped the site for the development of the community of Butler, the new Butler, Tennessee. The townspeople, they did not move their houses, but they moved all of their furniture, all of their possessions. In December of 1948, they started to fill the reservoir behind the new dam. And the reason it's called the town that would not drown, in 1954 and in 1983, there were 2 serious droughts, and they exposed the long-covered community. Here is the original Butler, Tennessee. Here is a less serious drought situation, but we see some of the underwater structures. We see a house and some kind of pier and board that were exposed during a period of drought. And here is the new town of Butler, Tennessee. Looks like a pretty nice layout. So with all these newly constructed dams, how did the people benefit? It did bring electricity to rural areas, and the electricity made life much easier for the people. Thinking in terms of women, washing machines, refrigeration, the modern appliances that were existing at this point as late as the 1940s. It made farms more productive, and we'll see the contributions that electrification made in that particular area. It did allow for industry. You have electricity. There are machines that are going to be powered. You can produce more things. Excuse me. And it did provide jobs for the people of the area. The TVA actually set up model farms. They had an entire teaching program for men and women. They taught farmers the new soil erosion techniques, and electricity allowed them to power irrigation systems or pump water into their fields so that they could get higher production from their fields. After World War II, especially, the use of new and modern fertilizers would help them produce better and more crops. Here is one of those schools in Clarksville, Georgia in 1937, where the boys are learning essentially to become butchers. In 1946, teachers are being taught better farm practices. Because of the erosion from centuries of flooding, they entered a program of reforestation. They tried to introduce fruit trees, nut trees, so that number one, the farmer would get some produce as well as it would help control erosion. Today, they continue with a reforestation program. They want to manage the forests and grasslands that were created by this. They want to recover endangered species and ecosystems. And they partner with local and federal agencies to accomplish some of this work. They established extension programs, which exist still today. They assembled demonstration kitchens early on in the 1930s. How were people to use these new electric appliances? How did it change their lives? They did do tree research, and here again, they distributed those fruit and nut producing species of trees. Current programs, they do have a home uplift program that provides free energy efficiency upgrades. And they also wanted to protect the hydropower generators. They have the Hydro Life Extension Program to rehabilitate and upgrade those generators. Here is one of those classes in Rutledge, Tennessee in 1970. And it's providing teachers, it's training teachers so that they can go out to their classrooms with new material for their students. Lastly, the whole Tennessee Valley provides a great deal of recreation. They stock lakes with trout. They created miles and miles of trails. And they have a schedule for releases of water from 8 of the dams so that they can have whitewater festivals similar to Colorado. So let's look at some of the documents that might be available for your family members if they lived in one of those 7 states. And we're going to see that some of these workers came from outside of the area as well. So here we have A. Odell Weathers. He is living in Mississippi, and he is a construction foreman on a TVA dam. Here we have the 1940 census, and we have Ernest Jones, and he's a lineman for the TVA. And what's interesting is he's from Arkansas. He's living in Arkansas, but he's working for the TVA. Another 1940 census. This is Frank Morrow, and he works in a laboratory for TVA dam construction in North Carolina. Working in a laboratory, he might have been working with disease control. Here we find in Alabama, we find Ori McGee, and he is a reporter sprayer, TVA mosquito control. J.O. Bell, right underneath him, is a switch operator in a TVA powerhouse. Herbert Haley is a district super safety engineer. In 1950, we still are employing, we're still providing employment through this. Here we have Lee Edwards. He's a phosphate supervisor for the TVA. And William O. McGee, who is a biological aide for the TVA. It's interesting to note, William O. McGee is a brother of Ori McGee that appeared on the previous page. So whole families are involved in this. Here we have Jess Davis, and I'm not exactly sure what this person does, but he's a farm stripper. And I'm wondering if one of the later dams that might have been constructed in the 1950s timeframe, would he have been working to relocate families, working TVA dam construction. And here we have in 1950, the South Holston Construction Camp in Tennessee. And we see all of these people are working on the TVA dam. There are laborers, there are carpenters, mechanics, a drill operator, a shovel operator, a powder man. So we're exploding things, a janitor, a time checker, a long truck driver, and a cement finisher. So multiple occupations. And we see people from various places as well, Tennessee, Georgia. One of the gentlemen's from Nebraska, North Carolina. During World War II, we find that Ellis Haddock is working for the TVA nitrate plant. So here again, they are making ammunition for the war effort. Henry Richardson is making maps and surveys in Waverly, Tennessee for the TVA, perhaps for the construction of a future dam. Madden Forbes, he works at the TVA Wheeler Dam that we saw earlier. And Robert Jeffries works at the Kentucky Dam. Turner Malone, TVA malarial control, still working. We find on death certificates. This is the death certificate for William Ori McGee that we saw earlier, and he is a safety engineer for the TVA. And we see his obituary, which also identifies his brother down at the bottom. Oops, Ori McGee, who also worked on the dam. We find also in Find a Grave, some of the people that were relocated did become unknown. There are records for many of the burials that did take place And we will be looking at some of those so that hopefully this situation does not exist for many families. Ancestry does have two specific files for TVA relocation, cemetery relocation, and the other for family removal. And we're going to look at some of those because there is fascinating information if you dig deeply. Here is the web page from Ancestry, and we're going to look at Elizabeth Smith for this particular instance. And we see that the name Elizabeth Smith appears numerous times. When you see the birth date and you see the death date, you want to match all of those entries and look at the files under each one of those entries because different information is contained in them. So if you find multiple instances of a name, make sure that the birth date matches your person, the death date matches your person, and look at all the files for that particular name. And this is cemetery relocation. So we find that there is an index card, and her grave was relocated during the construction of, or prior to the construction of the Watauga Reservoir. She was born in 1824 and died in 1889. This might be some of the only information that you have for Elizabeth Smith for her birth and death dates. She was originally buried in the Allen Cemetery, and they have the exact location of where her grave had been. And she's going to be reinterred in the Butler Memorial Cemetery, and they show exactly where she will be reburied. They had to obtain authorization for the removal of the grave from family members. So in this particular case, we see that Catherine Cole, and the relation is that I believe it's Elizabeth Smith that is Catherine's mother. So we do see this removal, grave removal record. There are 4 parts on the record. There's the removal order. There's the actual disinterment report, followed by a transportation report, and a final certificate of removal. Each of these gives you the information that more specific information that was contained on that index card. And we see that it is occurring in 1947, even though she died in 1889. We see also that Elizabeth had a monument. There was a tombstone. So we have the paperwork for the removal of the monument for Elizabeth as well. Here we have a grave removal permit for Nancy Cole, and it is her daughter, Elizabeth Smith. So apparently, yeah, Nancy is the daughter. And she certifies that it's okay to go forward with the removal. We'll look at another example. This is for Jacob Davis. Here again, we have the grave removal index. He's as a result of the Hiawassee Reservoir. He is being moved from the Hiawassee Baptist Church to a private cemetery, Roberts Private. And they have the location for his grave and who is authorizing this removal. By looking at a separate file, we find a new listing that shows Jacob Davis, where he's being moved from, where he's being moved to, and when this is occurring. And yet another file, we find the removal record with its standard 4 parts: the removal order, the disinterment report, the transportation report, and the certificate certifying that it has been completed. A grave removal permit for Effie Roberts, and this is the actual, this is the actual certification that Effie signed in order to move Jacob's resting place. In searching through some of these files, you may also find actual photographs of the work being done. There were numerous photos in this particular acquisition. The family removal and population readjustment case files. These are fascinating. If you did have somebody in the Tennessee Valley that had to be relocated, there are numerous pages within the documents, and they do give a lot of information about the family at that particular moment in time. It gives you a view of what life was like when they had to be removed, whether it was the 1930s or the 1940s. It gives you a detailed snapshot of the condition of the family. We're going to look at J.F. Searley. And the first thing we find is a survey of families. This is a 6-page document with approximately 60 questions in it that ask about the family, the number of children in the family, who the children are. We have other information about what kind of farming is he doing, how success indications of what is he producing, to give you an idea of how successful or impoverished the family is at this particular time. This is a straightforward questionnaire asking for these various pieces of information. Number one, did they even own their property, or were they renting the property? Lots of details in the 6 pages. But what is far more interesting is when you come to the family case file. They were interviewed by TVA personnel. So we see here the listing of the family members, but we're also going to get an objective narrative throughout this family. You know, what is their home like? Who are the members of the family? What are the resources that they have? And in talking to various members of the family, we see there are interviews with some of the children. We have Wesley Searly also, and he has a hive of bees. So one of the interesting questions is, what is the family's attitude toward the TVA? And it appears that the Searly family either had not heard about it, which is hard to believe because others are being relocated, or perhaps they had a negative view. But the interviewer had to provide them what was the advantage to if they were to relocate, um, as to opposed to what are the disadvantage if they do not cooperate in their with their move. And here again, they interview Jeddick Searly. They have a home visit, and we get a recording. So this is what gives that snapshot of, exactly where the family was at that time, and what were the conditions that they were living in, and what was the promise for them. The National Archives has numerous records for the TVA in these various record groups. This would be part of submitting a questionnaire. These records are not online, but it would give you some of the information. A lot of the information is actually about the construction of the TVA as opposed to the families and what they had to sustain. But they do have photos. So that concludes today's program on the TVA. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to entertain. But next month, we're going to also look at another national government agency. We're going to look at the National Park Service and look at the history of that and see, how were your people involved? Did they visit national parks? Did they work in national parks as teenagers? Or are they professional employees of the national park? So I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you again for joining us.